with filters? Well, this problem first came up a few months ago when I was shooting some 18-foot yachts on Sydney Harbour, and I was having trouble getting a sharp photo. If we zoom in on this one, you'll see here that even though this photograph was shot at 1/600th of a second, it's quite shaky and it's not even focused correctly. And I thought at the time there was a problem with the lens, and so I kept taking similar shots. I got the same problem over and over again. Blurry photographs, not sharp, too much movement, even though I was shooting with a fast shutter speed. So I changed lenses and put on a 100 to 400 lens on the camera and continued to shoot. And you can see here that these photographs are perfectly sharp, correctly focused, no shaking whatsoever. So I kept thinking to myself, there's a problem with this particular lens. And so I looked at this and I did a few more tests, and then finally I worked out what the problem was. After much testing, much examination of photos, and it turned out to be not the lens after all, it was a filter that I'd put on one of these lenses. Now, the lens I was shooting with initially, where I had all these shaky problems, was a Nikon Z mount 24 to 200 lens, which is quite a versatile lens, good for travel, and I'd previously used with really good results. So I suspected the lens was faulty. So I did some testing, and this is what came out of the testing. And these photographs are pretty boring, but it just shows you what happens. Here's a detail of a photograph just taken of some bushes near my home, and this one's taken without any filter on it at all, and it was shot at 1/400th of a second, and you can see it's quite sharp. So then I put the polarizing filter on, and all of a sudden we see not only is the image not sharp, but it looks to have had added movement put into it. So this is quite bizarre. So I took that polarizing filter off, and I put another brand of polarizing filter on the lens, and this one was actually shot at an even slower shutter speed, and yet it's still perfectly sharp. So this is quite a bizarre problem. I've never struck this problem before, and when I contacted the supplier, they claim to have no knowledge of this sort of an issue before, and even looking at the filter itself, it looks in perfectly good working order. A polarizing filter has two pieces of glass that rotate against each other to create the polarizing effect, and the filter looks perfectly okay, and yet we get this bizarre problem. So the solution to the problem is, if you have an issue like this, try different filters from different manufacturers until you see whether it's the filter or the lens at fault. I can't understand how this would have affected the lens operation, but somehow it quite plainly has, because we've gone from that to that simply by putting on a different polarizing filter and all other shooting conditions exactly the same, and going back to no filter at all, the image is still quite sharp. So quite a bizarre and unusual issue that came up, and in well, over 50 years of using cameras and filters, I've never struck a problem like this before. So let's now go and have a look at what we might use filters for in our digital photography today. And before we get on to look at filters as a general thing, I just wanted to point out that all of these shots that I've used for the test were taken at the 200mm end of the focal range, and what you're seeing there is actually a crop of what was in the frame. So we've enlarged it quite a bit, but you can see the problem is quite unusual, and something that I've never struck before. So let's now have a look at the humble filter. So filters in photography have been around ever since film was invented. And of course, in the old days of film, we would use filters for color correction. We would use filters for black and white exposures, such as the red, orange, yellow, green filters, often used for black and white photography, and some other specialized color filters. But often we would use a warming or a cooling filter with our old film usage to try and balance out the unusual lighting conditions. But of course, as we move to digital photography in the modern age, we really don't need any of those color filters, but we do still use things like polarizing filters, what would euphemistically be called a UV or a skylight filter, often used as protection for a lens. And then we would get into things like neutral density filters in order to slow movement down in brighter conditions. And there are some things like graduated ND filters that some people like to use, and other specialist filters, but essentially the main ones that we see today are polarizing skylight or UV filters and neutral density filters. So let's now have a look at when we would use this type of filter. So looking at polarizing filters, firstly, polarizing filters are a very versatile filter, and they're used in conditions where there's generally good bright sunlight, and you can use the polarizing filter to darken the contrast or increase the contrast in the sky, and also cut down reflections in water. And they're used for all sorts of purposes, and generally the most powerful effect is going to be at 90 degrees to the direction of the sun. But nonetheless, they're a very versatile filter, and that's why I use one quite often. So a couple of other examples here. Polarizing filters, again, cutting reflections from water and increasing contrast in the sky. And even in less than ideal lighting conditions, they still have an effect. And things like looking at, this is a sandstone formation north of Sydney, and again, photographing that in bright light, you can use the polarizing filter to cut down some of the reflections and intensify the colors. And even for early morning photography, the same thing applies again. And even photographing in the forest where you've got a lot of subdued light, you still are going to get a lot of reflections from things like leaves and foliage, and you can use a polarizing filter to just minimize those reflections and just calm everything down. So polarizing filters are probably the most versatile filter that you will have on your camera, apart perhaps from the ubiquitous UV or daylight filter, which most people, including myself, use as a protection for the lens. Now, there are two schools of thought on this. Some people think that they're totally useless, but I've had a couple of instances where there's been a bit of an accident and the UV or skylight filter has protected the lens from damage, and I'd rather throw away a $30 or $40 filter than a $1,500 or $2,000 lens because it was damaged. So I look at that as a cheap form of insurance. But back to the polarizing filter, again, multitude of uses, but used carefully can enhance the photograph a great deal. And again, as I said, in the forest where there's water, this one was actually taken with a polarizing filter, but in very low light conditions, hence the slow shutter speed. And even in bright light, again, the polarizing filter will cut reflections from all sorts of surfaces and intensify the color. So I find that I use a polarizing filter a lot of the time, not all the time certainly, but in a lot of instances it has a great deal of use. So buy a good polarizing filter, try and avoid the cheap brands, and stick with the good quality brands. I'm now using a brand that's comes with a lifetime guarantee, and I'm hoping I don't ever have to call on that guarantee. One thing to remember when using polarizing filters is that you lose 2 stops of light going through the lens, so your exposures are going to be longer and you need to either adjust the ISO or your aperture accordingly. But certainly the benefits of using a polarizing filter usually outweigh the downsides. So moving on from the polarizing filter, the other thing that's used quite often is a neutral density filter, and that helps when we want to slow things down in brighter light, where you want to get that calming influence of settling down movement in water. This was taken as a very early morning photograph just on sunrise, and the exposure was 25 seconds with a a neutral density filter attached to the camera, and so it's flattened out all the movement in the water. Now, not everyone likes that effect, but again, used in the right circumstances, it can really enhance your photography. And the similar thing is here with the waterfalls. If you want to get that really milky effect and the lighting is quite bright, a neutral density filter is what's going to do it for you. And in this particular photograph, what I've done is I've cheated a little bit. I've taken one photograph without the neutral density filter, and you'll see here that there's quite a lot of movement in the water in this left-hand corner, and then I've taken another exposure with the neutral density filter attached, and I've blended the two photographs together so that I've got the appearance of moving water here, and then it's been slowed down and turned into milk in the bottom of the image. So you can use it for all sorts of different effects. Similar sort of effect here, again, two exposures, one faster shutter speed, one slower, blended together to create an interesting effect, or at least one that I think is interesting. You may or may not agree. And of course, in the big situations like this where you have a major series of waterfalls, this is of course in Iceland, and trying to get a different sort of image with movement in the water, I'd always recommend that if you're in this situation, take a lot of different exposures using different shutter speeds until you find one that gives you the appropriate sort of movement that you want. And again, a more recent one taken in Western Australia, middle of the day or late afternoon, and I wanted to calm the water down, so we've got this sort of milky effect of the water around the rock formations. So one way to get our long exposures or to control exposure differences is using a neutral density filter, but another way to control that difference in brightness, where a lot of people tend to reach for a graduated neutral density filter, is to just merely shoot a number of exposures and blend them together to create an HDR image. This one was taken a few years ago in Tasmania, and again right on sunrise, and there was a very big difference in brightness between the foreground rocks and of course the sun coming over the horizon. So taking a number of exposures and blending them together in Photoshop or Lightroom to create an HDR image, you can avoid having to worry about using a graduated ND filter. And the problem I find with graduated ND filters is that you can adjust them so that the graduated part transitions at the horizon line, but the problem is that anything that sticks up above that is going to be darkened unnecessarily, and it's sometimes quite tricky to get that effect just right. So it's a lot easier just to take 3 or 4 exposures, blend them together later on, and you've got an image with a greater dynamic range. And again, similar things here up in the Karijini National Park in Western Australia. Very, very big differences in brightness levels between the bottom of the gorge and the sky. And again, taking multiple exposures and blending them together gives you the desired result. And another example where you've got this sunrise light on the edge of the gorge, and then the bottom part is deep in shadow. Again, multiple exposures blended together to create an HDR effect. Is much better than trying to fiddle around with a graduated neutral density filter and try to make that work, particularly where you've got a very unusual shape of brighter sky. So in summary, in this very short video, filters have multiple uses in photography, but be sure when you're using a filter that it's not degrading the image quality. Check the lens, check the focus, and check to see whether there's any unusual effects that you're experiencing with filters. Generally, a better quality filter is going to give you better results and probably last longer. So I hope this little video has been of use. I'll be back soon with a few more videos on some other topics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.